Hello, friends. You may have heard that Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral in Scotland. The new king is her son, Charles, and all the newspapers are full of obituaries for this 70-year-long reign. But one thing that they don't tell you is how she became queen in the first place. Because there's a reason why she sat on the throne for so long, a reason why she outlasted 14 prime ministers. It's because she was the only one of them who understood how to play the political game. And let me tell you, the British royal family knows how to play the political game better than anyone. You see, when Elizabeth ascended to the throne, Britain was still recovering from World War II. It was a very different country than it is today. So in order to understand how she became the longest reigning monarch in British history, we need to go back to the beginning. Elizabeth was born in 1926, and at the time her father was just the Prince of Wales, meaning that she wasn't next in line to the throne. That honour belonged to her uncle, King Edward VIII. But that would change a few years later when Edward decided to abdicate the throne. Now, there's a whole story there that I won't get into, but the short version is that he wanted to marry a divorcee named Wallis Simpson, which was against the rules at the time. So instead of ruling, he became a private citizen, and his younger brother George VI took the crown. This made Elizabeth's father the new Prince of Wales, and Elizabeth herself the heir to the throne. Now at this point, Elizabeth was only 10 years old. So while she was educated in history and government, she probably didn't know a prime minister from a prime rib. But that would change in 1937, when her father became King George VI, and she became Princess Elizabeth. At this point, she started taking on more royal duties, and she met Winston Churchill. Now, Churchill is a legendary figure in British history. He led the UK during World War II and helped win the war against Nazi Germany. But by the late 1930s, he was out of office, and England was on the path to peacetime. Still, no one knew what the future held, and when war broke out between Britain and Germany in 1939, Churchill was called back to lead the country once again. Now, when this happened, Elizabeth was 13 years old, and she became the princess known for waving to troops during the Blitz. She spent much of the war in relative luxury at Windsor Castle, where she lived with her parents and sister. Meanwhile, London was being bombed day and night. But still, she saw enough of the war to understand its effects. In fact, the war had an enormous impact on her life. Her father would often take her aside and explain the responsibilities of the monarchy, and she even had a secret escape plan in case of invasion. If you've ever seen the movie The King's Speech, you might remember the scene where King George VI practices his radio broadcasts over and over again. Well, Elizabeth did the same thing. She practiced her own speeches over and over again, even though she never gave one. But the war also taught her something else. It taught her who could be trusted and who couldn't. While the British royal family has always been close to the government, Elizabeth understood that they were not above politics. In fact, she realized that they were right in the middle of it. You see, throughout most of Elizabeth's childhood, the government subsidized the royals with funds from the treasury. The idea was that if the royal family seemed rich, then the public would be more likely to support them. But the expenses were becoming too much of a burden on taxpayers. And as the war dragged on, the government wanted to cut back even more. By 1947, the royals were paying for a quarter of their expenses. But Elizabeth's father refused to sign the agreement. Instead, he wanted to keep the government subsidies coming. This meant that the royal family would be dragged deeper into politics, and Elizabeth would soon find herself at the center of it. The year before, King George VI had gotten sick with a serious lung infection. At the time, doctors weren't sure if he would survive. And Elizabeth was summoned to his bedside, not as a child, but as a future monarch. They told her that she might become queen before she married, and she responded, "I'm ready." But as it turned out, her father would recover. So Elizabeth was able to focus on her wedding to a dashing young prince from across the pond. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. By all accounts, it was the wedding of the century. Elizabeth was the star, and the entire country looked on with optimism as their beloved princess found her happily ever after. But sadly, that wouldn't last long. Just 2 years later, her father was dead, and she was now Queen Elizabeth II. Now she had a husband and 2 children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, but that didn't mean that she had any experience in government. To make matters worse, the country was still recovering from the war, and the economy was in sharp decline. Many people felt that the monarchy was nothing more than a relic of the past, but Elizabeth was determined to prove them wrong. She reached out to Churchill and other members of her father's cabinet and made it clear that she wanted to continue his policies. But she also brought in some fresh ideas of her own. For example, she created the Queen's Award for Export Achievement to recognize companies that helped boost the economy through exports. Still, it was one thing to continue her father's legacy and another to make a name for herself. To do that, she needed to play the political game better than anyone, and she was determined to do exactly that. One of the best ways to do that was to stay completely neutral. But sometimes staying neutral isn't easy. Take, for example, the Suez Crisis of 1956. This was when Egypt seized control of the Suez Canal, which was a major problem for the British. On the one hand, they couldn't afford to lose control of the canal. On the other hand, they couldn't risk starting another war. And so they turned to the United States for help. But President Eisenhower was reluctant to get involved, so Britain turned to their last hope, Queen Elizabeth. She invited Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to tea and told him that he had her support. But that wasn't enough. Soon enough, France, America, and the UN called for a ceasefire, which Britain had to agree to. It was a humiliating moment for the British, but Elizabeth remained neutral throughout. And that brought her tremendous respect from both sides. Even President Nasser of Egypt reached out to her to say that he appreciated her neutrality. Throughout the crisis, she remained calm and collected, never letting on how she really felt. And that's the key to playing the political game, never letting on how you really feel. You see, if you show your cards, then everyone else can react accordingly. But if you keep your cards close to the chest, then you can make your moves without anyone knowing what you're thinking. This is the art of political neutrality, and Elizabeth played it better than anyone. As the years went on, she continued to reach out to world leaders, inviting them to tea and accepting their invitations. She stayed neutral in the Cold War, never siding with either America or the Soviet Union. And this brought her tremendous respect from around the world. In fact, it's one of the reasons why she was able to sit on the throne for so long. As the world changed around her, she remained a constant, and people appreciate that kind of stability. Today, we live in a world that's constantly changing. The way we work, the way we communicate, the way we consume media, everything is constantly evolving. But there are still some things that remain the same. And one of those is the respect and admiration that we have for Queen Elizabeth II. She was the longest reigning monarch in British history, but she was also the longest reigning monarch in my personal history. When I was growing up, she was queen, and as I got older, I came to appreciate her wisdom and her grace. She was the epitome of political neutrality, and that's why she was able to sit on the throne for so long. Now, you might think that neutrality is boring, but that's only because you're thinking about it the wrong way. Neutrality isn't about being boring. It's about being strategic. It's about knowing when to speak up and when to stay quiet. And Elizabeth got that right more often than not. That's why she became the most respected monarch in modern history. She understood how to play the political game better than anyone. Thank you.